Hi, good afternoon. I'm Catharine Richert, reporter for Minnesota Public Radio based down in Rochester, and we are delighted to have Kiarra Zackery with us today for this Facebook Live event about racial covenants and housing inequality in Minnesota. Kiarra is the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the City of Golden Valley, and she's also involved in this organization called Just Deeds. It's helping cities and homeowners around the state find and legally disavow racial covenants. Thank you so much for being with us today, Kiarra.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine. I'm excited to discuss this topic.
Yeah, it's directly in your wheelhouse. So we'll get started here. So the reason we're having you on today is because I recently wrote a story about how this kind of small and scrappy group of volunteers in Rochester are going through reams of property documents looking for racial covenants, and they're participating in Just Deeds. What they're finding, which I think is really interesting, is that a significant number of them were actually perpetuated by the founders of Mayo Clinic. If you don't live in Rochester, it's hard to understate how much Mayo Clinic's culture really just, influences the city around us. But when I started this reporting project, I have to admit that I knew broadly what racial covenants were, but I didn't really understand the impact that they've had on how our communities look today. And I am guessing that our audience might be a little confused about what these are too. So we're just going to start with some racial covenants 101. What are they and where can homeowners find them?
Okay. Well, a racially restrictive covenant is language that would contractual language that is found in property deeds that um, basically provide contractual agreements about the space, the home, and the property. So there are a number of covenants in all property deeds, and that will say that the space must be used for residential space. There would be other things in a covenant in the covenants of a property that would say, the house has to be this big, you have to use these materials, in the setback, so how far the house can be from the street needs to be at least this, no more than this. The lot needs to be this big. It would also say in the late 1910s and until they were made illegal in the 1950s, which racial groups were allowed or not allowed to live or inhabit that space. And so it would be words, it would be lines in a document on your property deed that would say, no one outside of the Caucasian race, no um, person of African, Moorish, Asian descent, or indigenous descent can occupy or purchase this land.
So sometimes that language is really specific and sometimes it's really broad. And certainly in my reporting here in Rochester, I saw both of those, a whole range of examples. So one question we got a lot in advance of this Facebook Live event is whether they're still enforceable today.
So the good thing is that they are not. Fair Housing Act in Minnesota in 1957, and then the Federal Fair Housing Act that came in the 60s, they became unenforceable, and they are illegal. So it was a two-step process. One is that we will not enforce them. The courts would not enforce racially restrictive covenants. So if someone sued someone else for having a racially restrictive covenant, the courts would not uphold it. And then, and that was in the late 40s. In the 50s, the courts became stronger. So we used the Supreme Court to say, now they're illegal. You can't put them in documents either. And we will not acknowledge them legally should they still be in the document. So no worries. We may see, though, lots of things are happening at the Supreme Court level. So the Just Deeds Project, I think, now feels the disavow process is probably more impactful now than when we started back in 2020.
So actually, let's move on to that. Let's say you're a homeowner, you've pulled out, these dusty, crinkled papers from your historic home, and you find this language in your documents and you don't want it there. What can
Mhm.
you do? And can you just sort of walk us through like what that process might look like for someone who wants to get
Yeah.
rid of that language or disavow that language?
All right. Sure. So if you live in Hennepin County, the process is pretty simple because Mapping Prejudice has mapped and found all of the covenants in Hennepin County. So it would be, again, going to a website, putting in your address, you'd then be able to find the covenant. Once you've identified whether or not you have the covenant, the work of the Just Deeds Project is that we link you with a pro bono attorney, and then you fill out a very short application that basically says, this is my property, this is the owner of the property, and I wish to do this. And the attorney then files an additional piece of paper into your property deed, or depending if you have what's called an abstract deed or a Torrens deed. If you have a Torrens deed, they put a little note where the covenant is and says, this owner disavows this covenant, and it would be legally unenforceable. If that's not the case for you, you would go to your recorder's office. You could, you find this language, and you would have to file that paperwork with your county's recorder.
So, we know that they're no longer enforceable. But I'm wondering how you see their impact today. That's a big question, right? I bet you kind of see it everywhere, but you're in Golden Valley. So, what do you know about Golden Valley, how it looks today as a community that you can trace back to these racial covenants that really sort of divided, right? Golden Valley, a century or so
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. So, Mapping Prejudice, when they first started finding racially restrictive covenants and mapping them, they found causal links in really three main areas. One, the price of housing, right? Homes that have racially restrictive covenants on average are worth about 15% more than homes without racially restrictive covenants. The racial demographics of neighborhoods that have racially restrictive covenants are greatly unchanged, even though the rest of the neighborhoods around them may have continued to diversify. And they also found that racially that once racially restrictive covenants um, were no longer enforceable, that um, Black and Brown and Indigenous populations still stayed in their same areas, right? This is true also for the city of Golden Valley. Um, so the city of Golden Valley has literally thousands of racially restrictive covenants. And although the city of Golden Valley is a first-ring suburb of Minneapolis and borders North Minneapolis, one of the most racially diverse neighborhoods within the city maintains to be 80% white, and have a white only population that's much higher than the rest of the first ring suburbs. Even in equally as affluent suburbs as like Edina, our white only population is higher. And we correlate that to having racially restrictive covenants on specifically the border that has between Minneapolis and Golden Valley. Um, and that impacts historically who's been expected to be in the neighborhood or within our city and within our community. It impacts, sort of the reputation of who's welcome in the community. And these are all things that we really are trying to work towards mitigating today, of course, through positions like mine, and also in our participation of Just Deeds, is saying, that there is this there's a history of selling exclusivity, of not being welcoming, whether that was 100 years ago or not, recognizing that we now need to put in some extra work to do those things. Other things that we see in the city is that we have a higher average median income than, again, some of our neighboring cities, and also some of our neighborhoods. Our home values are higher as well. Our median home value is indicative of that 15% increase because of racially restrictive covenants. And even in neighborhoods that didn't have racially restrictive covenants, if they were next to or adjacent to those neighborhoods, they follow the same trends. They follow the same racial demographic trends, the same, home value trends and income trends.
Yeah, and I should note here in Rochester, this was a question I had for city leaders here. Like, what are you going to do with all this information? And they're, several steps behind Golden Valley in gathering it and looking at maps and creating maps. But, they were talking about how it's still a little unclear how racial covenants have shaped our city, but they do know that neighborhoods that are uh, relatively affluent and white had racial covenants. They also know that homeownership among people of color in our city is low, and I think one city official mentioned that it was among the lowest that she'd actually ever seen. It was notable in her sort of professional experience, and they're looking at ways to figure out, how can we use this information to make different zoning decisions? How can we use this information to target money, for home ownership classes, that sort of thing? And I think that's all to come. So Rochester, I understand, was the first greater Minnesota city to sign on to Just Deeds, and I believe Mankato now is embarking on a similar project. I
Yeah.
think when people think about racial covenants or hear the term redlining, they think about big cities, right? They think about Minneapolis and St. Paul. What do we know about racial covenants elsewhere in the state? Can you find them really in any community that you look in?
Yes, you can. Interestingly enough, I gave a talk to the oh goodness, I'm forgetting. It was I'm sorry. We gave a talk to the Minnesota Department of Transportation and the Minnesota Surveyors Association. There we
Oh.
go. And surveyors were saying, I've seen them everywhere. There isn't a place in
Hmm.
Minnesota where I have surveyed land and I haven't seen racially restrictive covenants. Patterns that we see across racially restrictive covenants, you can find them near bodies of water. You can find them near parks. You can find them near golf courses. You can find them in those community. You can find them near those community amenities where you would imagine there to be exclusivity and affluence, right? So anywhere where we wanted to sort of protect certain amenities, we wanted to protect, um, what people would consider a certain level of lifestyle, right? That we can find racially restrictive covenants there. And it's not, while there's a correlation, again, between the FHA redlining maps and racially restrictive covenants, especially in the metro area, it's almost a one for one, right? It basically is a one for one. But those patterns are still generalized when you think about geographic amenities. We see them even in greater Minnesota.
So we're getting some really good questions coming in, but before we get to them, I want to ask you about what we know about how big institutions may have been involved in perpetuating racial covenants. Again, what stood out to me in this story is that 25% of the 800 plus racial covenants that have been mapped so far were written by Mayo Properties Association, which was basically an entity that turned Mayo Clinic from a family business into like an actual nonprofit hospital. And I thought that was unusual, but do we see other big institutions involved in perpetuating racial covenants in any way?
Yeah, I think one of the ones that we can look at within that a great example of this is the University of Minnesota, right? Racially restrictive covenants. So we know that the University of Minnesota is built on Indigenous land, but we also know there's racially restrictive covenants on parcels within all of the university's land, and it's not. uncommon for the practice to happen, right? When you think about, well, which industries or which folks are going to have power to create a system that creates complete barriers to things like property ownership, and who would be most interested in maintaining high value of land resources, right? It's these big major institutions that would need, their property to value in a certain way, that would need to leverage things like FHA lending, and if they were going to end up doing things like selling back parcels to developers in order to make more money. And so this practice, and that at the time was considered best practice. If you spoke to realtors, if you spoke to investors, if you spoke to developers, um, these were the conversations they were having. They were saying that if you want this to value in this way, if you want developers to be interested, if you want to sell these properties, you're going to need to have to insert racially restrictive covenants.
So this is when we talk about structural racism, this is what we're talking about, right? There is a policy that the federal government followed that gave organizations like Mayo Properties Association an incentive to racially
Absolutely.
restrict and segregate neighborhoods. So, if
Absolutely.
you're just joining us right now, we are speaking with Kiarra Zackery. Kiarra is the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the City of Golden Valley. She's also involved in Just Deeds. We've been talking a lot about this group. It's an organization that helps cities and homeowners find and legally disavow racial covenants. If you want to know more about this topic and you have any questions, you can just drop them in the comments and we'll get to them here shortly. So, the first question coming in from the audience is, if covenants are illegal anyway, why map them?
Because we love this question at Just Deeds because we get it every time. It doesn't matter who we're talking to. It doesn't matter if we're talking to a professional association of 500 people or if it's a church community group with 10 people in the room. We always get this question. And the reason why we map them is specifically because of the work that we were just talking about. If we don't know, if we can't identify the patterns in which we have intentionally provided additional like economic resources, right? We poured resources into these communities where we had racially restrictive covenants, right? There's so many correlations between redlining maps, where racially restrictive covenants are, and life outcomes. We see that with how our schools are funded. We see that with who has access to green amenities and therefore have more resilient communities to things like climate change. We see that in access to healthcare. We see it in transportation. We see it in policing patterns. We see it in life outcomes like, and other health outcomes like maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates. We see it we overlay this map with almost any racialized life outcome and any other predictor of good life. And we find that it doesn't matter how we layer it. It doesn't matter um, what the outcome is. That they all follow the same types of patterns. So specifically for policymakers, if we use this map within our decision-making process, in the same ways that we intentionally divested or the intentional negligence of specific communities, we now know where to intentionally reinvest. Where do we spend our time and energy to build resilience in community, in health outcomes, in school and education outcomes? And in things like, we had a forum just last week in the city of Golden Valley, green infrastructure. All of these things we can line up with where racially restrictive covenants were. And that's why we need this information. We can't really do the work of fixing racism if we don't just lay it out and use it to learn from.
So here's another really great question from our audience. Do we have any idea what would happen to someone if they broke a covenant when they were still legal and enforceable?
Yeah, we do have ideas, and it's well documented. We have an example. It's the Lee family in South Minneapolis. They actually didn't break a covenant. The neighborhood that they were living in was an adjacent neighborhood to a covenanted neighborhood. And the community around them, the Lee family is a Black family, the community around them uh, organized mobs for an entire summer. They attempted to burn their home down. They threatened the Lee family. They even at one point killed their dog, to get the Lee family to leave the home and to leave the neighborhood. Um, they ended up having to have the police come and protect their home so they could come in and out as they pleased. Mobs literally would organize nightly, and the Lee family is a really well documented example, but that's not the only example. That there would be um, other attempts at pushing people out. Prospect Park, there were considered race wars between white neighbors and Black neighbors trying to live in the neighborhood, and where there would be physical altercations and mob mentalities. And so whether or not they were legally enforceable, or whether or not the families broke covenants, there was definite social consequences when folks broke covenants. And even for realtors, there's stories of realtors that would dismiss covenants and sell these properties to families of color within these times. And they too would receive social consequences, and professional consequences for doing that work, and for trying to provide those opportunities.
So Valerie just commented, and she's tuning in right now. She says that so much press is given to racial covenants, while ethnic covenants are glossed over and religious covenants are ignored. I don't know if there's any truth to the glossed over or ignored, but I am wondering what we know about those other two buckets, right? Religious covenants or ethnic covenants.
Yeah. Well, the specificity. This is a two-part question, so thank you, Valerie.
Sure.
What we recognized is that there is very real and true specificity that happened at the beginning of racially restrictive covenants. There's this listing, right, where you would see all of these different racial groups or ethnic groups, and also religions, right, that were in racially restrictive covenants. And honestly, I think it got to be too complex as the state started to diversify. So it really just got to be that anyone outside of the Caucasian race could not own or occupy. Religious covenants, specifically those against folks practicing Judaism and Jewish folks, were outlawed decades before racially restrictive covenants were. And so you see, for example, in the city of Golden Valley, in the 1910s and the 1920s, there were restrictive covenants that would include people of color and Jewish population. After the 1930s, those were no longer legal or to put into covenants. So you see that language drop off. The other reason why we center a lot specifically on racially restrictive covenants is because 100% of the covenants, right, every single covenant that has been found has named specifically and been impacted for written for Black people. And we still see that when we talk about those home ownership gaps, right, that those home ownership gaps still persist for the racial groups that were listed. So it's not as if that history is not important, or that it's not getting, or that we're glossing over it, right? But the ways and intention around providing home ownership opportunities for ethnic and religious groups that were named in racially restrictive covenants in the 19 teens and the 1920s has sort of mitigated through this legal action. The real direct intention has not to support, again, home ownership levels and integration within these neighborhoods. We still haven't seen, even a century later. So the focus has been on race and racism and racially restrictive covenants for that reason. Not to say that those other groups aren't important.
Sure. So, one thing that really struck me in the process of reporting this story is that it's not like you can just go online and Google, does my house have a racial covenant, right? You either have to have documentation that you have in your house that you can easily access to look at it,
Mhm.
or, all of these property records have to be digitized, which they happen to be in Olmsted County. So, if you are living in a community where this documentation might not be easily accessible, how might you find out if your house has a racial covenant? And then a follow-on question, how important is it to this mapping effort for all of this stuff to be, accessible in the modern age here?
Yeah. Okay, so part one, if you don't have the original property records to your home and you don't want to read through the dozens and hundreds of pages, um, you can go to your county recorder's office and do what's called a data request. And your county recorder's office will do that digging for you. They'll be able to see historically. So, again, depending on the type of property record that you have, whether it's abstract or Torrens, they'll have to go through and see every hand that switched, that the property switched in order to maybe find a covenant. And so the county recorder's office has all of those records, and that's where you can go. The second part of the question is specifically about why is the mapping so important? And I think this really just ties back to, if we have yet to identify and address the harm, in this case, complete barriers to home ownership and economic investment in certain communities, we can't do the work of undoing it, right? We know what works as far as economic investment and tools to bridge and create opportunities for home ownership and and to ameliorate wealth gaps. We kind of have a formula for that, right? If we're going to be intentional about how we direct policy, how we direct resources, this mapping effort helps us do that.
Right. So we have a few comments coming in online. Lynn says, times are changing. Younger generations are more aware of these things and changes happening. Another commenter wants to know what they do to help undo some of the impacts of racial covenants. So walk us through how someone might volunteer for Just Deeds or do something in their community to address these historical problems.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing you should do is, if you're interested in volunteering with Just Deeds or Mapping Prejudice, visit either one of those websites. You can Google Mapping Prejudice, and you can find events, and they also provide training opportunities. And the great thing about volunteering with Mapping Prejudice is that you can do it whenever you want. They provide you some software tools, and you can decide to read and research covenants, probably for Ramsey County at this point, and log in this information whenever you want to. And it's very flexible in that way. Other things that you can do for the Just Deeds is visit the website. And one of the things that we hear from community is that we've got a number of toolkits. So if you want to organize your neighborhood, for example, and organize a showing of Jim Crow of the North and talk about racially restrictive covenants, and have a dreaming session with your community about what you all can do. That's one of the things that is sort of like a catalyst for a lot of change within communities. Other things that we've seen folks do is organize affordable housing coalitions. We've seen that within the city of Golden Valley, and they're a group that whenever there's opportunity for affordable housing Or those things are being talked about at the city council level. They come and they advocate for affordable housing opportunities, and not just rental opportunities, but also home ownership opportunities. At the city council, folks can organize their churches and their other faith communities to join Just Deeds as a organization, and they can put forth the mission through fundraising. Some of our community partners have created yard signs that they are selling, and the proceeds that they sell, that they make from selling yard signs, they are donating to land trusts to provide first-time homebuyer opportunities within the city, specific, like one of the African American Land Trust. And so, I mean, those are a few different things, but that folks can do. And please, the opportunity, we would love to have more community volunteers with Just Deeds. Anything from helping us design Instagram posts, you can help us with. You can help us clear the email inbox. There's a number of ways that you can help.
So you and I kind of talked a little bit about this in advance, but I know that talking about and digesting information about tools of segregation, like racial covenants, can be really hard, and bring up trauma, old trauma for some people, especially people of color. And I'm wondering if you just have any suggestions on how to navigate this information. Maybe you're a homeowner of color and you've just discovered that your housing deed contains this information. How do you
Yeah.
process this?
Yeah. Well, I think what I suggest is, one, acknowledging that the practice was harmful, and to listen to that is traumatic, right? I'll share my own story briefly. I grew up in a neighborhood that was racially restricted. My father's home in South Minneapolis has a racially restrictive covenant on it, and we watched Jim Crow of the North, and we saw our neighborhood highlighted, and you instantly feel something inside. For me, it was a really hard thump in my chest. And it really lifted a veil and added context really to my entire childhood, right? That there weren't other families in our community that looked like we did. We were the only Black family on the block. My dad, 20-something years later, is still the only Black man on his block. And so it is, for us, it was like, oh, okay, that's what we were dealing with here. And as far as what do you do to metabolize, as Resmaa Menakem says, as you metabolize the trauma, I think you really engage deeply in self-care, right? Some folks need to walk it out, or exercise it out. Some folks need to talk it out. What feelings come up for you when you hear about tools of segregation, systemic racism? How does that make you feel? What information, what questions do you have about it? Like, what are you noticing, not only about the information that's being shared to you, but also what are you noticing that's happening within your body? What questions do you have? Is another thing that I would ask yourself. What questions do you have? Write them down and find them, right? Find the answers to them. There's so much research about racially restrictive covenants now, the impacts, their legacy. Finding these questions, finding the answers to your questions will definitely help. And then lastly, what do you feel compelled to do? I would ask myself, what do I want to do now? And it may not be something that you know right away, but for communities of color, it could be like, I'm really now interested in what it means to be a homeowner. It could be, what ways do I support creating homeownership opportunities within my own community for folks that have been historically unable to, or historically excluded, right? So I think that it's, I call it the noticings, wonderings, and actions. It's NWA, right? But just notice,
Hmm.
what about this information? What do I notice about my body? What questions do I have? And what do I feel compelled to do right now? And kind of going through that process will help, I think, metabolize um, some of the trauma that you may feel, and that all folks, I think, can feel from learning this information.
Yeah. So we're going to have to log off here in just a minute. But before we do, Kiarra, I just wonder if you have any parting thoughts, anything else you want people to know about racial covenants or what Just Deeds is doing?
Well, what I would like people to know is that, if this is something that interests you, and you want your city to take part, and they haven't taken part, community is how folks join Just Eats, how most cities join Just Eats. So if this is a cause that you really want to support and push forward, please write your council members, continue to organize in that fashion. As always, Just Deeds provides educational opportunities to any size group anywhere. So if you would love for us to continue to have this conversation in a different space, please visit our website, and click I would like to request a speaker so we can get to know and see you all, because that's another reason why we really love to do this work.
Kiarra, thank you so much for joining us today. Kiarra Zackery is the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the City of Valley. Golden Valley. She's also involved in Just Deeds, just talking about it. It's an organization that helps cities and homeowners find and legally disavow racial covenants. And if you want to know more about Just Deeds and whether your community is involved, you can visit justdeeds.org. Thank you so much for being with us today, Kiarra.
Yes, thank you so much, Catherine, for having me.